Something was wrong with the world long before you arrived. The grace that guided you across the fog-shrouded sea was not a new gift. It was a reinstatement, a quiet restoration of something that had been revoked, stripped from the people who had come to be called tarnished, and offered back, at last, after a silence that stretched across generations. That silence was not empty. It was full of things that had been building, full of the slow accumulating weight of choices made centuries ago by a being who was trying, with everything she had, to hold together something she had built from the most broken possible foundations. You arrived in the lands between to find the Erdtree still standing, golden and vast, and possibly bright, even in the deepest hours of the night. You can see it from almost anywhere in this world, from the tops of crumbling cliffs, from marshlands choked with poison, from the rooftops of ruined cities that were once, not so long ago, full of people who believed in the grace that Tree was giving them. It has been the constant in a world of ruin, the one fixed point, the thing that endures when everything around it has broken and scattered and gone to war with itself. There is something about the Erdtree at night that I find difficult to describe without sounding like I am reaching for poetry. It is the quality of the light it gives off, that particular gold, warm and unwavering, casting no shadows because it seems to illuminate from every direction at once. When you stand beneath it and look up into that canopy, you understand, at some level below rational thought, why people built their entire civilization around it, why they buried their dead at its roots, why they thanked it in their prayers and named their gods in relation to it. That light is the kind of light that makes you feel, however briefly, that things are going to be all right, that the world is ordered and you have a place in it, and that place is safe, but something has shattered beneath its roots. The order that the Erdtree represented, the order it enforced, quietly and absolutely, across every corner of the lands between, lies in pieces. And the demigods who inherited those pieces have turned upon one another in a war so consuming, so total, that whole regions of this world still carry the wounds. Kaled, transformed into a wasteland of scarlet rot where the very sky has changed color, where the creatures that survive do so only because they are too broken to die cleanly. Liurnia, swallowed partly beneath the waters of some ancient catastrophe and left to sink, its towers rising above the surface like gravestones. The royal capital of Lendel, its gates sealed against a world it once governed, its streets haunted by the remnants of something that no longer fully remembers what it was. You were called here to restore what was broken. But before you can understand the shattering, before you can make sense of why a god would raise her hand against the very foundation of the world she built, you need to understand who Marika actually was, not what she became, not the official version shaped by centuries of theology and political convenience, the person underneath the icon, not the figure in the churches, not the divine mother whose outstretched stone arms welcome you at every roadside chapel across the lands between, whose image is so omnipresent that after a while you stop truly seeing it the way you stop truly seeing wallpaper, not the God whose name is spoken as a blessing, whose will is invoked to justify every law and every exclusion and every act of quiet cruelty that the Golden Order permits. Those are the versions of Marika that the Order produced. The statue, the icon, the idea that a civilization built of its own god in order to make that god easier to live under. The real Marika is something different. She was a shaman. She came from a people who were treated as tools by a civilization that believed it was working toward the divine. She was born into suffering, endured that suffering with the patience of someone who was already calculating the distance to the exit, and then climbed, through a ritual designed to destroy her, through a betrayal so vast it erased an entire civilization, to a throne above the world. And then she built something genuinely beautiful in places and genuinely terrible in others, something she poured herself into for centuries, something she maintained at great personal cost long after she had stopped believing that maintaining it was the right thing to do, something she eventually looked at with the clear, cold eyes that only come after all the illusions have been used up and decided could not continue. In this video, we will follow Marika from before her ascension, through the forgotten civilization that shaped her and tortured her people, through the ritual that made her a god, through the golden age she built, and the quiet, accumulating choices she made over centuries that cracked its foundations from within. We will trace the lives of the people around her: Godfrey, her first Elden Lord, Radagon, the aspect of herself she held in constant private war, Godwyn, the son she may have sacrificed to begin the ending. We will arrive, at last, at the moment she raised her hand against the Elden Ring itself, and we will try to understand, not judge, but understand, what brought her to that moment. Because I think the answer to that question is not simple, and it is not comfortable. The shattering was not madness. It was not an accident. It was the final honest act of someone who had spent centuries maintaining a lie she could no longer sustain, and understanding what that lie was, and why she built it, and why she kept it going as long as she did. That is what this video is about. Make yourself comfortable. There is a long road ahead. All of it leads somewhere worth going. To understand Marika, we must first understand the world she was born into, not the world of the Golden Order, not the gleaming civilization that the Erd Tree presides over, not the realm of grace and divine law that is already collapsing when you arrive. What came before all of that? The older world, the stranger one, the civilization that existed before the Erd Tree was planted, and that was erased so thoroughly that most players complete the game without ever fully understanding it existed at all. The lands between were not always golden. Before the Erd Tree cast its light across the hills and valleys, before the Golden Order gave law to the living and the dead, before even the name Marika carried any weight at all, there was another civilization here, one that worshipped not a tree of gold and the grace it dispensed, but something far more ancient, something they called the Crucible. The Crucible is not precisely a place. It is more accurate to call it a condition, a primordial state of existence in which all living things were once mingled together, inseparable, before the long process of differentiation that produced the world as we now understand it. In the Crucible's time, there was no meaningful boundary between a human being and a beast, between flesh and root, between one body and another. Everything was everything, one vast, breathing, undivided mass of life, before life had sorted itself into the categories and forms that we would recognize. The civilization that held this belief, that organized itself entirely around the reverence of this primordial state, is known in the lore as the Hornsent. And the Hornsent believed, with the absolute conviction of people whose entire philosophical tradition pointed in one direction, that the Crucible was holy. They believed that the primordial chaos of the Crucible, this state of mingled, undifferentiated life, was not something to be overcome or left behind, but something to be revered, the truest expression of what life actually was. Before civilization imposed its structures and its separations and its categories, the Erd Tree, with its golden order and its insistence on clear distinctions between the living and the dead, between the graced and the graceless, between what is holy and what is not, was, from the Hornsent perspective, a corruption, a false tidying of something that was meant to be wild and entangled and impossible to fully define. And the Hornsent prized, above almost anything else, the signs that the Crucible had not entirely released its hold on the present day. The horns that grew from the skulls of their most blessed individuals, the scales that appeared on the skin of the chosen, the strange animal growths and mutations that marked certain people as touched by something older than any civilization could claim to have built. To bear a horn in the eyes of the Hornsent, was to carry the mark of the divine. It was evidence that the crucible still reached through into the present, still touched the world, still left its imprint on those it favored. A person born with horns was not a person to be hidden away or whispered about or regarded as a curse. They were a person to be celebrated, to be elevated, to be understood as carrying within their body the literal fingerprint of the oldest holy thing that existed. Their civilization organized itself around this belief with extraordinary thoroughness. Their architecture reflected it. The great spiral tower that rose in what would become the realm of shadow, the tower that stands even now in that impossible land behind the veil of Moog's domain, is shaped as a helix, a double spiral, the form that in our world is the shape of Dinah itself, the molecule that carries the code of life. Whether this was intentional or coincidental, we cannot say. What we can say is that the shape communicates something about what the people who built it believed, that life is not a straight line, not a hierarchy, not a ladder ascending towards something cleaner and more perfect, but a coiling, recursive, self-entangled thing that loops back through itself and holds its origins inside its present form. Their rituals reflected the same belief, their caste structure, their understanding of what a human being ultimately was, and what a human being was ultimately for. Everything within the Hornsent civilization pointed back toward the same conviction that what they had inherited from the Crucible was not a remnant to be discarded, but a root to be honored. And their scholars, those brilliant, devoted, thoroughly convinced scholars, spent generations trying to replicate the Crucible's process deliberately. If the Crucible could produce signs of divinity by accident, they reasoned, then surely a careful, controlled, scientifically managed Crucible could produce a god by design. The mutations that appeared spontaneously on those who lived near the great Crucible tree could be cultivated, could be directed, could be shaped into something more than a horn or a scale, shaped into something capable of holding a great rune, capable of carrying the Elden Ring, the collected laws of all reality in the lands between. This ambition produced the jars, and to understand what the jars represent, we must spend a little time with the people who were placed inside them. You have encountered the jars if you have spent any significant time in the lands between. Those great clay vessels, sealed and still, occasionally inhabited by creatures who move with the deliberate, patient quality of beings who have been thinking about the same question for a very long time. They are not rare. They appear in dungeons, in ruins, and the consecrated snowfield where the great jar Alexander finally sheds his old shell and becomes something more. They are by now a familiar piece of the world's furniture, but in the realm of shadow and the lands that open beyond the veil of Moog's domain, you encounter the context that finally makes sense of them. You see, carved into the walls of the great tower and preserved in the fragmentary records of a civilization that no longer exists, what the jars were for. And when you understand that, the familiar vessels you have been passing for dozens of hours acquire a weight they did not previously have. The Hornsent built the jars because they believed, with the conviction of scholars who had spent generations on a single problem, that a single human body could not hold what they were reaching toward. A true god, a vessel for the Elden Ring, the collected laws of all reality in the lands between, would need to be more than one person. The contradictions, the multiplicities, the vast and impossible scope of what the Elden Ring represented, no individual human consciousness, no single set of runes, could contain it. A great rune is already a law for many lives, not one. The Elden Ring is all such laws gathered together, every principle by which the world operates held simultaneously in a single object. To hold it, you would need to be, in some genuine and structural sense, more than an individual. This is not a unique philosophical problem. The alchemical tradition, which informs so much of Elden Ring's imagery, had its own answer to it, the rebus, the divine androgyne, a being that had unified the opposites within itself and thereby become complete in a way no half of anything ever could be. But the Hornsent scholars were not alchemists working with symbol and metaphor. They were engineers working with flesh. So they looked for a way to make someone who was more than one person, literally, physically, soul merged with soul, flesh folded into flesh, consciousness expanded outward to encompass more than any individual had ever encompassed before. The shamans were the key to this. Among the Newman people, the people who would one day include Marika herself, there existed a rare and singular gift, the ability to merge with other living things, not as a metaphor, not as a spiritual feeling of connection, but as a physical reality, a capacity that left visible, structural evidence in those who exercised it. We find the evidence of this preserved in the shaman village in the realm of shadow, where the remains of one shaman appear to have merged herself into the roots of a great tree. Her bones are not crushed beneath those roots, they are woven through them. She reached out at some point in her long life and chose to become part of something larger than herself. The boundary between her body and the tree simply dissolved, the way a river dissolves into the sea, not vanishing, but becoming part of something that contains it. The Hornsent saw this gift and understood it as a resource. There is a particular quality of horror in this, the horror of being seen clearly and correctly, understood fully and accurately, and having that understanding used against you. The Hornsent did not misunderstand the Newman shamans. They did not fail to recognize the gift for what it was. They recognized it precisely, categorized it precisely, and decided precisely how it could be used to serve their purposes. The ritual they designed was terrible in the specific, systematic way that only rituals designed by people who genuinely believe in what they are doing can be. They were not simply sadists, though the distinction may offer little comfort to those who suffered. They were scholars who had convinced themselves that the suffering they were causing was a price, and that what lay on the other side of that price was worth paying it. They used the language of holiness to describe what they were doing. They wrote about it as though they were offering an elevation, a path to something greater than ordinary human life. In their own minds, they were not villains. In their own minds, they were builders. A shaman was placed alive into a great clay jar. Into the same jar, other bodies were placed alongside them, criminals, largely, people whose lives the civilization had already determined were owed to the ambitions of the Hornsent in the same way that any other resource was owed. The shaman was wounded beforehand, cut, deliberately, carefully, so that the body's healing instinct would cause it to reach outward, to seek what could help it close and mend. And in the darkness of the jar, what surrounded the reaching shaman was other flesh, other life, other souls. The merging that the shaman's gift made possible was redirected. Rather than choosing to reach toward a tree or a root or some other living thing in an act of voluntary union, the shaman reached because the body demanded it and found what the Hornsent had placed there. The hope was that from this merging, something genuinely new would emerge, a being composed of many, a consciousness that was not one person's perspective, but many, held simultaneously within a single form, a being large enough, multiple enough, complex enough to hold a great rune, to become what the Hornsent needed. The scholar who designed this ritual wrote about it as though it were a path to sainthood. The word he used, preserved in one of the few fragments of Hornsent writing that survives, is translated as sanctified or made holy. The jar was a sanctifying vessel. The process was a sanctifying process. The person who emerged, if they emerged, if the process produced something rather than simply a corpse, would be sanctified, would be, in the fullest possible sense, blessed by the crucible. This distinction between what the person inflicting harm believes is happening and what the person experiencing that harm actually lives through is one of the questions that Elden Ring asks us to sit with, quietly and persistently throughout the entire game. It is not a question the game ever fully resolves, and I think that is deliberate. The game trusts us to hold the ambiguity. To understand that something can be genuinely beautiful in its intentions and genuinely monstrous in its execution. To sit with the fact that the Hornsent believed in what they were doing with complete sincerity, and that this sincerity did not make what they did any less terrible. The Newman people, Marika's people, were the shamans. They had come to the lands between from beyond the sea. They were a people of unusual longevity, unusual gifts, and from the perspective of the Hornsent civilization, unusual utility. They were not invaders. They were not conquerors. They were a people who arrived in a world that quickly decided what they were for and proceeded to use them accordingly. To be a Newman in the Hornsent civilization was to be a resource with a heartbeat, to understand, in the specific way that children absorb such things before they have language for it, that the world around you had decided exactly what you existed to become. Children learn these things not from explicit statements, but from accumulation, from the way people look at them and then look away, from the spaces they are not invited into, from the work they are given and the work they are never offered, from the words used to describe people like them in the mouths of people who do not believe they are listening. Marika grew up inside this understanding. She grew up in a village of her people, the shaman village, the ruins of which still exist in the realm of shadow. The bones of the shaman who merged with the great tree, still present among those roots if you know where to look. She would have known, from very early on, what the Hornsent believed she was for. She would have watched it happen to others, seen the girls with the gift taken away, seen the gaps they left behind, understood what the gaps meant. And at some point, we cannot know precisely when, cannot trace the specific moment the decision crystallized from grief into purpose. She decided that she would use the Hornsent's own ritual to become something they had not intended her to become, something they could not control once it existed. This is the thing I come back to when I think about Marika, the patience of it. To look at a system designed to consume you, to understand that system fully and clearly, and to decide not to flee, not to resist directly, but to work within it until the moment came when working within it gave you more than it had taken. That is not the patience of acceptance. It is the patience of someone who has already decided the outcome and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. Before we follow Marika through the gates of divinity, I want to spend a little time on something that complicates her story in ways that I think matter, and that it would be dishonest to skip over. Marika did not become a god through the power of the ritual alone. She had help, or collaboration, or something that sits in the uncomfortable middle space between those two words, from a force that predated the Hornsent civilization and would outlast it by an unimaginable margin. The Greater Will. The Greater Will is the most distant and most powerful of the divine forces that touch the lands between. It does not appear as a character you can encounter directly. It is not a being you can speak to, or reason with, or challenge in any honest confrontation. It does not even have a voice in the conventional sense. It is known only through its agents, the two fingers, those strange alien envoys that arrived in the lands between long before the Golden Order existed and have been guiding the affairs of this world ever since. And through the Elden Beast, which is itself a manifestation of the Elden Ring's will, a creature that has swum through the cosmos before finding a home within Marika's body, and through the grace itself, that golden light that moves through the world, touching certain people and not others, drawing them toward purposes they have not chosen and cannot fully explain. The greater will is not omnipotent. It does not directly control the beings it works through. It operates, as far as we can tell, through selection and pressure rather than through direct command. It chooses Empyreans, beings worthy in its judgment to hold the Elden Ring, and it nudges and guides rather than ordaining. Whether this is a limitation of its nature or a deliberate policy, or simply the only way that cosmic forces of that magnitude can work across the gap between divinity and ordinary experience, we do not know. What we know is that the two fingers were in the lands between before Marika's ascension. We believe, from the seed talismans found at the finger ruins, those mysterious sites scattered across the lands between, where the fingers seem to have been present at some very early point, that they may have had a hand in the Erdtree's creation, that they provided, in some form, the means by which a great golden tree could be planted and grown in the heart of what would become Marika's capital. They selected Empyreans from among the living beings of the world, beings with the capacity, in theory, to receive the Elden Ring and become something greater than themselves. They were, in the language of their own kind, doing exactly what they had been sent to do. And at some point, they were in contact with Marika. The exact nature of this contact is something the lore is careful not to make fully explicit, and I think that careful ambiguity is one of the most important authorial choices in the entire game. Whether Marika chose to work with the two fingers or simply accepted their assistance when it aligned with her existing intentions, or was herself being guided toward a conclusion that served their purposes as much as her own, these are questions that Elden Ring leaves open with the specific deliberateness of a story that trusts its audience to sit with complexity. What I believe, and I want to be clear that this is my interpretation, shaped by spending a great deal of time with this lore, is something like this. The two fingers and the greater will had their own interests in what happened at the gates of divinity. A new god, a new order, a new age of grace extending across the lands between, these served their purposes entirely. They offered Marika what she needed to complete the ascension, and she accepted, because what she needed was exactly what they were offering. But I do not think Marika was naive about this arrangement. I think she understood, with the clear-eyed intelligence of someone who had spent her entire life watching powerful beings use less powerful beings for their own purposes, that the greater will's assistance came with an expectation, that she was being set up to be something specific, that the god she was going to become would be, in some genuine sense, the greater will's god, a vessel for its purposes, as much as a being with her own. Whether she intended, from the beginning, to eventually subvert that expectation, to build something that looked like what the greater will wanted, but was also, secretly, quietly, her own, is something I find myself returning to again and again. I cannot prove it, but when I hold the whole shape of her story in my mind and look at what she built, and especially at what she eventually did to it, I find it very difficult to read her as someone who simply forgot that she was not fully in charge of what she had become. What came through the gates of divinity with Marika was not only hers, but what she did with what came through. That is where her story truly begins. The gates of divinity stand at the summit of the Hornsent's great spiral tower, carved into the living rock of what would become the realm of shadow. This was where the ascension was meant to happen, where the being that the Hornsent had spent generations preparing, the merged, multiplied creature of jar and ritual and deliberate suffering, would step through, be recognized by the greater will's grace, and become a vessel for the Elden Ring. This was the goal. The point of convergence toward which everything the Hornsent had built was aimed. The Hornsent did not intend for Marika to keep what lay beyond those gates for herself. Their design, as best we can piece it together from the surviving fragments, the murals, the item descriptions, the testimony of the places themselves, was to use Marika as the vessel, but to retain control of the vessel. A god requires a body to inhabit. A civilization requires a god to derive authority from. A caste of scholars and priests requires a god that validates their position at the top of the hierarchy. The Hornsent expected to be the ones who decided how the authority flowing through Marika was exercised, who would serve as lord, what the order would look like, how the divine power would be directed and contained and used in service of the civilization that had created the conditions for its emergence. Marika stepped through the gates and took everything on the other side. We see images of this moment preserved in the murals and carvings that survive in the realm of shadow, worn by time, faded at the edges, but still legible to those who know what they are looking at and have spent enough time sitting with the silence in those places. Marika, arms raised, not in supplication, not in the posture of someone receiving a gift from someone greater than themselves. In triumph, in the posture of someone who has just taken something back. The image of a god ascending and the image of a prisoner escaping are in this moment the same image. This is, I think, one of the most extraordinary visual choices in Elden Ring, the way the iconography of divine ascension and the iconography of liberation are made to overlap so completely that you cannot separate them. Was Marika elevated? Undeniably, was she freed? Also, yes. Can you hold both of those things simultaneously in your understanding? The game believes you can. The game asks you to. She gathered to herself the accumulated energy of the tower, of the gates, of the centuries of Hornsent ritual and sacrifice, and genuine scholarly devotion to this one great ambition. She took it all. The grace of the greater will extended to the vessel of the Elden Ring, and the vessel was Marika, and Marika chose what to do with that. And then she turned the furnace golems against their creators. The furnace golems are still there if you know where to look. Enormous mechanical constructs, remnants of a technology that the Hornsent developed for labor and war. They are not subtle things. The ones that remain in the realm of shadow are vast, slow-moving, carrying within their torsos the heat of a contained fire that can scorch the landscape for considerable distances. In the present day of the game, they are obstacles, hazards, something to be navigated around or, if you are bold and patient, fought, but in the moment of Marika's ascension, they were instruments. She sent them against the civilization that had held her people in torment, the scholars who had placed shamans in jars and called it a path to sainthood, the priests who had presided over centuries of this and never once questioned whether the price being paid was being paid by the wrong people, the architects of a system that had decided the value of Marika's people before those people had had the chance to demonstrate anything else. The Hornsent civilization did not survive. I want to pause here because this moment contains within it everything that follows. It is the seed from which the entire tree grows, not the Erd tree, but the narrative tree, the story tree, the accumulating meaning of everything that Marika does for the next several centuries. Marika did not emerge from her ascension as a being of pure benevolence, or divine mercy, or the compassionate grace that her statues project across the lands between. She emerged as a survivor, someone who had been broken by the world's cruelty and had made herself unbreakable in response. Someone who had watched her people suffer, who had endured what the Hornsent believed they were owed, and who had waited, with the extraordinary patience I mentioned earlier, the patience of someone who has already decided the outcome for the moment when the power to end it was finally within reach. When that moment came, she did not hesitate. This is not a condemnation of her. I want to be clear about that, because the game itself is clear about it in its way. The violence of what she had endured was real. The need to end it was real. The people who built the jars, who designed the rituals, who maintained the system, they had made choices that had consequences, and those consequences came for them. But the violence of her response to what had been done to her did not end with the Hornsent. It continued, transformed, encoded, invisible, into the foundations of everything she built afterward. The world Marika made was built by someone who had never had the chance to set down what had been done to her, someone who had survived by becoming hard in exactly the way she needed to be hard, and who carried that hardness into the construction of a civilization that was supposed to be different from what she had known. But you cannot fully escape what you have been made by. You can be aware of it. You can work against it. You can build something genuinely better in many ways and still carry the shape of the wound inside it because the wound was there first, and the building happened around it. What is built that way carries its origins inside it, however beautiful it becomes on the outside. and the lands between is in many ways genuinely beautiful. With the Hornsent gone and the gates of divinity behind her, Marika crossed the sea. She arrived in what would become the lands between proper, the great peninsula of land that the game takes place across, and she began building an order from whatever remained of what had come before. This was not a simple task, and the lore does not present it as simple. The lands between at that time were not empty. They were full of things that had their own histories, their own claims on the world, their own gods and practices and reasons for being what they were. There were the ancient dragons who had held the Elden Ring in an earlier age and who had their own relationship to power and sovereignty. The dragon's era had predated even the Hornsent. In that older time, the Elden Ring had existed without a golden order, without a single governing principle imposed across the whole of reality. It had been something different, wilder, less directed, reflecting the nature of the beings who held it. When Marika's order began to rise, the dragons did not simply yield. Some of them fought, some of them made accommodations, some of them, like Placidusax, the dragon who had been Elden Lord before, there was a Marika, whose ruined lair still exists deep beneath the Farum Azula, lost their gods entirely and were left waiting, frozen in amber at the edge of a storm, for a return that would never come. There were the giants of the north, enormous beings who preserved a great flame, the fell god's fire, the flame that could burn the Erdtree itself. The giants were not easy to subdue. Their size alone made them formidable, and their flame made them dangerous in a way that nothing else in the lands between was dangerous. What eventually happened to the giants is one of the more troubling episodes in the early history of the Golden Order. Marika made a bargain with someone, or gave a command to someone, that resulted in the near extermination of their kind. A few survived, and survive still, in the frozen north beyond the mountain peaks, carrying a grief and a rage that has not diminished across the centuries. The fell god's flame was not extinguished, it was captured, preserved, kept burning secretly in the depths of a seal, the fire giant, the last of his kind, bearing it in his chest as both prisoner and guardian, the final insurance policy of a people who had been defeated but had not forgotten what they were protecting. There were the Carrion Royals, scholars who followed the moon and practiced arts that the Golden Order would eventually have to decide how much it could tolerate. The Carrion tradition was old and sophisticated and represented a fundamentally different understanding of the cosmos than the Golden Order offered. The Golden Order organized the world around the Erdtree's light, solar, warm, visible, defined. The Carrion tradition organized itself around the moon, reflective, changing, mysterious, tied to rhythms that were older than any civilization. The two systems were not simply different. They were, in a deep sense, incompatible, and Marika's order would have to come to terms with that incompatibility eventually. There were simply people who had lived here before Marika arrived, and who would need to be brought within the Order's grace or pushed outside it. Some were welcomed, some were not. The wandering merchants, those strange figures in their great hoods, carrying their wares along roads that have long since emptied, were among those who were given a particular and uncomfortable place in the new order. They exist within the lands between, but outside the grace. They are present, but not fully acknowledged. They persist, but do not inherit. The Erdtree was planted, its light spread, and the order began to be enforced. Death was among the first things Marika changed. In the world before the Golden Order, death had been part of the natural cycle. Bodies burned in ghost flame, those blue-white fires that still flicker in certain corners of the world, souls departing west across the sea towards something that lay beyond this world, a rhythm of ending and beginning that had governed life in the lands between for as long as anyone could remember. That cycle was not painless, but it was honest. It was complete. It allowed things to end. Marika reached into the Elden Ring and removed the Rune of Death. Destined death, the principle by which souls could truly, finally, permanently leave, the mechanism by which the cycle of individual life could conclude and something new begin, the closing bracket of every sentence that a life writes. She removed it from the laws of reality and gave it to her shadow, a great beast man named Malekith, the Black Blade, with instructions to take it somewhere it could never be used, never be found, never threaten the order she was building. The official reason for this is something like death is the enemy of grace. The Erdtree's order, the great cycle of return, requires that souls remain within the system. A soul that truly departs, that crosses the sea and does not come back, is a soul that is lost to the Erdtree's roots, lost to the cycle, and a civilization built around the Erdtree, drawing its stability from the return of the dead to the root, needs the dead to actually return. People now died, in a limited sense. Their bodies stopped working, but their souls did not leave. They returned to the roots of the Erdtree. They were absorbed into its vast, patient interior, and in time, they were reborn. The cycle of life in the lands between became a closed loop, an eternal return, an age without final endings. To those within the grace of gold, this felt like grace. The fear of death, the fear of loss, the grief of watching something end completely and knowing that the ending is permanent, these were softened. The dead were not gone. They were resting. They would return. The bereaved could visit the site where they had buried their dead, trace their fingers over the stone, and trust, with the genuine comfort that real faith provides, that what lay beneath was not absence, but dormancy. To those outside the grace of gold, the eternal cycle was something else entirely. The wandering merchants, the misbegotten, those who lived in the bodies, and with the gifts that the order had decided were not worthy of its protection, they could not die their way out of a world that did not want them. They could not leave. The same mechanism that protected the blessed from loss trapped the excluded in endless repetition of a life they had not chosen and could not escape. The Erdtree's roots held their souls the same way the Erdtree's roots held everyone's souls, regardless of whether the Erdtree had ever acknowledged them as its own. But the Order's citizens did not see this. They saw the Erdtree's warmth. They felt the comfort of grace. They buried their dead at the tree's roots and trusted in the return. This is the structure that Marika built. And to build it, to defend it, to enforce it across a world that did not automatically organize itself around a single divine principle, she needed someone to fight for it. For this work, she chose Godfrey. We meet Godfrey late in the game when we finally reach the throne room of the royal capital and find his golden ghost seated on the throne of the kingdom he helped to build. Even as a ghost, a shade left behind when the physical man left the lands between generations ago, he is immense. Broad-shouldered, scarred deeply enough that the scars are visible on something that no longer has physical form. He carries a great axe, and he carries it the way someone carries a tool, easily, without performance, without the need to display it, in the manner of a person for whom this particular weight is simply familiar. Like it belongs in his hand, the way a pen belongs in a writer's hand. There is something quietly heartbreaking about him in this form. He is not defeated. He is waiting. He has been waiting for a very long time, through however many years passed between his exile and your arrival, through however many battles he fought in the lands beyond the fog, to keep himself sharp, to keep himself real, to keep himself from becoming nothing in the absence of a purpose, for the chance to do something that matters again, to fight for something worth fighting for, to have once more the specific dignity that only comes from being necessary. Godfrey was not born to nobility or to divine favor. He was a warlord, a man whose life before Marika's grace found him had been defined entirely by combat, not as a craft to be refined in the manner of a scholar warrior, not as a discipline with philosophical dimensions, but simply as a state of being. He had always been at war with something. War was the idiom through which he understood the world. the place where he felt most alive, most himself, most clearly what he was. When Marika's grace touched him and named him the first Elden Lord, it did not change what he was. It would not have been possible to change what he was, and I suspect Marika understood that and chose him in full knowledge of it. It gave what he was a purpose and a direction that it had previously lacked. It took the war shape of him and pointed it at something. He was ferociously effective. The campaigns of the early Golden Order, the wars against the giants, the subjugation of the dragons, the long negotiations and occasional battles that brought the various peoples of the lands between under the Erdtree's grace were conducted largely by Godfrey and those who fought at his side. He had a companion in those early campaigns that tells us something about his nature, Sarosh, a great lion who perched upon his back and shoulders, an embodiment of what Godfrey was before Marika's grace gave him a cause. Sarosh, we are told, was there to suppress the ferocity in Godfrey, to hold back the pure warrior nature that without a sufficient purpose to direct it would simply consume whatever was in front of it. He carried his own restraint on his back, and it had a face, and he chose to keep it there. This is not the portrait of a simple man. A simple man would not have needed the restraint, or would not have sought it, or would not have understood what it represented. The fact that Godfrey went into his greatest campaigns carrying the symbol of his own controlled nature says something about his self-awareness that the scale of his violence might otherwise obscure. Marika and Godfrey had children together. The demigods, who would eventually inherit great runes and go to war over them, were first simply children. And the history of those children is a history that the Golden Order tried very hard to edit. Morgott and Moog were born twins, marked from birth as omens, regarded by the Golden Order as curses, as signs of something that should not have been possible in a divine lineage, sealed away in the dark beneath the city their parents were building. The logic of the Order could not accommodate what they were. They had been born with horns, crucible marks, the signs that the Hornsent had revered and the Golden Order had suppressed. In a demigod lineage, this was not simply an embarrassment. It was a theological problem. If Marika's divine children could bear the marks of the old power, the power the Order was built on suppressing, then what did that say about the Order's foundations? The answer the Golden Order chose was to pretend they did not exist, to seal them away, to write them out of the official history and hope the problem was contained. Morgott spent his life proving that he was more loyal to the kingdom that had sealed him away in the dark than most of the beings who had been given its full welcome. He defended Lindell against the demigod armies with a ferocity that had no rational explanation except genuine devotion, a devotion that was, when you understand his circumstances, almost unbearable to contemplate. He fought for a kingdom that had decided he was its shame. He protected a legacy that had refused to acknowledge him. He did this not because he had been commanded to, not because he expected gratitude or recognition, but because he believed in what the kingdom was supposed to be, even if the kingdom had never believed in him. Godwyn was born differently. The eldest son, the beautiful one, the golden prince, whose every attribute seemed to confirm that the Golden Order was exactly what it claimed to be, the expression of a divine will working itself out through chosen lineages. He was beloved, not simply popular, not simply well regarded, but beloved, beloved in the way that very few people ever managed to be, in a way that suggests the feeling was genuine on both sides. Those who describe Godwyn in the lore do not describe a figurehead. They describe a person they actually liked. And it is worth noting that Godwyn's friendships extended in directions that the Order would not necessarily have approved of. He was close to Arganthe of the Ancient Dragons, an alliance that speaks to a generosity of spirit that did not require everything to be sorted into the right categories before it could be offered warmth. Then the grace of gold withdrew from Godfrey. We are not given the full explanation for this. The lore suggests that Godfrey's grace faded because his purpose had been fulfilled. The wars of the early order were over. The lands between were brought under the Erdtree's grace, and a man whose entire identity was structured around combat no longer had a war worth fighting. Without the purpose, the grace had nothing to attach itself to. Whether Marika withdrew it deliberately, whether the greater will withdrew it as Godfrey's usefulness to its plans concluded, whether it simply faded as grace apparently can when a person no longer has the purpose that originally called it forth, we cannot say for certain. What we know is that he was exiled. He and his warriors, those who would not leave his side even after the grace was gone, the companions and allies who had fought beside him through every campaign, and who made the choice, when his grace departed, to depart with it, crossed the fog, and left the lands between. They were the first tarnished. Wanderers in a graceless world, shaped into something harder by their exile, by the fighting they continued to do in lands beyond the sea, by the long years of waiting that followed. Godfrey's exile was not passive. He went into those far lands, and he continued to be what he had always been. A warrior without equal, fighting for whatever cause was available, becoming gradually harder and more himself as the softening influence of grace and civilization and political responsibility fell away. He became, over time, more purely Godfrey than he had ever been able to be while carrying the mantle of Elden Lord. And when, at the very end of the game, you face him in his true form, not the ghostly echo, but the man himself, returned at last, what you find is something that grace has stripped away almost entirely, leaving only what was always there underneath. He removed Surash, the great lion, the symbol of his restraint, lifted away and set aside. He has carried it long enough. He is ready to be, finally and completely, what he actually is. And Marika was, in a sense, alone for the first time since her ascension. Or rather, she was alone in the way that a person who contains another person within themselves is alone. Radagon of the Golden Order entered the historical record as a champion, a warrior scholar of considerable reputation, red-haired and striking, with a bearing that suggested both military precision and intellectual depth, who led Marika's armies into Liurnia of the Lakes and conducted a war against the Carian royals that ended not in outright conquest, but in a peace settlement cemented by marriage. He was sent by Marika, the histories say. He came as her general, her representative, the sharp edge of the order pointed toward a part of the world that had not yet been brought fully within its grace. The war in Liurnia was not simple. The Carian tradition was old and sophisticated, and Renala, Queen of the Full Moon, was no easy adversary. The magic she practiced, sorceries drawn from the light of the moon rather than the warmth of the Erdtree, full of cold blue light and strange geometries, and a patience that outlasted most opponents' ability to sustain their advantage, was genuinely formidable. The war ended in negotiation rather than conquest, cemented by marriage. Radagon wed Renala, and for a time, the union of the Golden Order and the Carian tradition seemed like it might produce something genuinely interesting, something that was neither wholly the Order nor wholly the old moon following ways, but some third thing that combined them. The children that came from this union seemed to embody that possibility. Radon, who would grow into a scholar warrior of enormous physical size, the gravity he bent around himself eventually became so great that merely approaching him required extraordinary effort, combining his mother's love of learning with his father's capacity for war. He studied the stars with the devotion of a true astronomer, learning their positions and movements and influences, and then applied that knowledge in battle in ways that his opponents found impossible to predict or prepare for. Rykard, who would eventually feed himself to a great serpent in pursuit of a philosophy about immortality and the consuming of gods. Rykard's path is one of the stranger narrative threads in Elden Ring, a demigod who looked at the system he had inherited and decided that the appropriate response was not to fight it or reform it, but to eat it, to consume the divine until he himself became something that no longer needed the divine's permission to continue. Ranni, who would engineer one of the most consequential acts in the game's history and spend the rest of her existence following a path that was entirely, stubbornly, brilliantly her own. Ranni is in many ways the character most worthy of a video of her own, a being of extraordinary intelligence and will who decided, from the inside of a system designed to tell her what she was, that she would decide for herself. But that is a story for another night. And then Radagon left Rinola. He left her for Marika. He had been Marika's general, had married into the carrion line at Marika's direction, had built something with Rinola, had children with her, had made a life with her in the specific and ordinary sense that involves daily proximity and shared concerns and the quiet accumulations of years. And then he left. He was recalled to Marika's side, and there he became her new consort. The political bewilderment this produced must have been extraordinary. The philosophical bewilderment must have been greater still. What did it mean that Marika's general had married the carrion queen at Marika's direction, had children with her, had waged a war that ended in peace, and was then recalled to Marika's side as her husband? Was the marriage always intended to be temporary? Was Rinola simply a diplomatic instrument that had served its purpose? Or was something else happening? Something that the historical record, organized as it was by the people who benefited from Marika's divine authority, had reasons to obscure. The fact that no surviving text from the lands between explains this transition clearly is itself a kind of evidence. The things that histories do not explain, the events they move past quickly without commentary, the transitions between one state of affairs and another that are described as accomplished facts without the process being traced, these silences have their own content. They tell you what someone decided was better left opaque. The revelation that Elden Ring eventually offers about Radagon and Marika is one of the most startling moments in the game. Even for players who have been given hints, who have noticed the red hair that Marika seems to share with Radagon in certain depictions, who have read the item description of the Elden Ring itself, which states plainly that Marika and Radagon are in some sense the same. The moment when the game makes it explicit carries a weight that no amount of anticipation fully prepares you for. Marika and Radagon are the same person, not in a metaphorical sense, not as two personalities sharing a body in the manner sometimes used to describe certain psychological conditions. In the most literal possible reading of what the lore tells us, they are one unified being, two aspects of a single entity, both fully present, both fully themselves, inhabiting a single form that can manifest as either. We see this most plainly at the very end of the game, when we reach the Erdtree's heart and find Marika crucified and broken within it. She does not simply summon Radagon to fight us, she tears him free from within herself. The act is violent in the imagery of it, deliberate, almost agonizing in the way it is depicted. They are not two separate people who happen to share an address. The separation itself is something that costs them. The seam between them is visible in the tearing. The alchemical tradition, which informs so much of Elden Ring's imagery and its understanding of what divinity is, describes the highest achievement of the great work as the Rebes, the divine hermaphrodite, a being that has unified the opposing elements within itself, male and female, sun and moon, body and spirit, action and contemplation. A being that is, in the most literal possible sense, more than one, and therefore capable of holding more than any single individual ever could. Marika is a Rebus, and her status as a Rebus is not incidental to her status as a god. It is the mechanism of it. She can hold the Elden Ring within herself, because she can hold within herself the contradictions that the Elden Ring represents. She is complete in a way that no individual can be complete. But completeness, it turns out, does not mean peace. It does not mean those contradictions are resolved. It means they are present simultaneously, in permanent, unresolvable tension, neither winning and neither willing to yield. Because Radagon, the aspect of Marika that is most visible in the historical record, the general, the scholar, the husband of Renala, and then of Marika, the figure whose red hair and martial bearing appear in so many of the Order's significant moments, was deeply and completely committed to the Golden Order. More committed, perhaps, than Marika herself. He studied its fundamental laws with a devotion that produced new sorceries, entire traditions of magic derived from his understanding of the Order's innermost principles. He fought its wars long after most would have considered the fighting done. He crafted spells based on his understanding of the Order's essence and gave them to his children with Rinala as gifts of love, an act that is touching in its way, and also, given what he was giving them, deeply revealing of what he was. He scratched into the very bedrock of the Erd tree. We see it still, carved into the stone in letters large enough to be foundational rather than decorative. A phrase, "To thine own self be true." This is Radagon, a being who believed so absolutely in what he was that he wrote it into the foundations of the world's most important structure, who was, within himself, one of the most self-consistent characters in a game full of people who contain contradictions they cannot reconcile. And Marika, it seems, had begun to doubt everything that Radagon's devotion rested on. The internal conflict between those two aspects of the same being, Marika's gathering doubt and Radagon's absolute devotion, must have been, by the time of the Shattering, something close to unbearable. Two halves of one consciousness, in total opposition about the most important question either of them had ever faced, unable to simply separate and become different people, each following their own conclusion, unable to simply agree because the disagreement was not a misunderstanding to be resolved with better communication, but a fundamental difference in what they had each become over the centuries, locked together in a form that could present as two, but could never fully become two. This is the tragedy that sits at the heart of Marika's story, beneath all the politics and the history and the great sweeping narrative of orders built and shattered. At the very end, the person who destroyed the Golden Order and the person who would have done anything to preserve it were the same person. They went to the Erd Tree together, and only one of them had a choice about what happened next. Let us pause here and take stock of where we are. We have covered a great deal of ground together, from the jars of the Hornsent through the gates of divinity, from the planting of the Erd Tree to the removal of destined death from the laws of reality, from Godfrey's great campaigns to his exile and the first tarnished crossing the sea, from Radagon's arrival in the historical record through the stunning revelation that he and Marika are one being, two aspects of the same consciousness in fundamental conflict about the most important question either of them has ever faced. What we have established is something like this. Marika came from a people who were used as raw material by a civilization that believed it was working toward the holy. She survived this by using the Hornsent's own ritual to ascend, to take for herself the power they had intended to channel through her while retaining control of it for themselves. She built the Golden Order with Godfrey as her Elden Lord, sent him into exile when the fighting that defined his purpose was done, and carried within herself a second aspect, Radagon, who represented everything about the Order she had privately stopped believing in. The Order, at its height, had brought the lands between under the Erd Tree's grace. The giants were defeated, the dragons mostly subdued or withdrawn. The crucible energy the Hornsent revered was suppressed, its signs treated as marks of shame rather than holiness. Destined death had been removed from the Elden Ring, and hidden somewhere it could not threaten the closed cycle that Marika had made. The great runes had been distributed to the demigods. The world was golden and stable, and for those within its grace, genuinely warm. That something was wrong beneath the surface, something structural, something that had been wrong since the very beginning, since the moment a shaman girl decided that the civilization torturing her people would be the civilization that made her a god, and that no amount of golden light could entirely conceal. We pick up now with the events that brought that wrongness to the surface at last, the events that cracked the Order's surface and let the air out before Marika did the rest herself. And these events involve, at their center, the son who had perhaps been sacrificed to begin the ending. The great runes were distributed to the demigods. We are not given a precise accounting of when this happened, or exactly how. What we know is that at some point before the Shattering, the demigods received shards of the Elden Ring itself. Each great rune was a piece of the laws that governed all of reality and the lands between. Each conferred on the demigod, who held it an amplified version of some fundamental aspect of their own nature, the ability to impose themselves on the world around them in ways that would not otherwise have been possible. The official interpretation of this distribution is succession planning. The demigods received their inheritances. Marika was providing for a future in which the order continued beyond her, held by her children and her children's children, maintained across generations in the way that any stable civilization must be maintained if it is to outlast its founder. I have thought about this interpretation for a long time, and the more I sit with it, the less it looks like succession planning, and the more it looks like preparation for something specific, something Marika already knew was coming, something she was, perhaps, preparing the ground for. Consider what the great runes actually do when they are held by individuals who are then freed from the Elden Ring's central authority. Each demigod, suddenly fully autonomous in the power they carry, becomes capable of remaking some piece of the world according to their own nature, not according to the Golden Order's laws, according to themselves. Radon, whose connection to the stars and to gravity was already part of who he was before the rune amplified it, becomes so saturated with that power that the ground bends beneath him. Melania, whose scarlet rot she had contained through decades of extraordinary discipline, becomes so much herself in the wake of the shattering that the containment fails, she blooms, spreads, covers all of Kaled in the decay that had been building within her since birth. Morgoth's omen power, which he had suppressed his entire life out of loyalty to an order that considered him a shameful secret, overwhelms him. The distribution of the great runes made the shattering catastrophic rather than merely significant. Without the runes in the demigod's hands, the breaking of the Elden Ring would have produced fragments, pieces of power without holders, dissipating into the world more or less harmlessly, waiting for someone to gather them. With the runes held by powerful individuals who had their own natures and grievances and ambitions, individuals who had, in some cases, been denied or suppressed or shaped by the Order's limitations their entire lives, the shattering produced something that could not be put back together simply by reassembling the pieces. Did Marika know this when she distributed the great runes? Did she understand what they would become in her children's hands if the Elden Ring were ever shattered? Did she distribute them knowing that when she finally broke it, those runes would serve as accelerants, catalysts for a war that would do the work of dismantling the Order in ways that she herself could not do directly? I cannot prove this. No item description states it plainly, but when I hold the whole shape of her story in my mind and look at the distribution of the great runes and the context of everything else she chose, I find it very difficult to read it as innocent. I find it very difficult to believe that the woman who had survived the Hornsent civilization by understanding exactly how systems of power operated did not see. When she placed a shard of the Elden Ring in each of her children's hands, what those shards would become. And then came the night that changed everything. The event that cracked the Order's surface. The night that introduced, into the sealed cycle of the Golden Order, something that could not be put back in its container. The night of the Black Knives, as one of the most significant events in Elden Ring's history, and one of the most carefully obscured. The surviving accounts of it are fragmentary. The people who had the most to gain from certain interpretations and the most to lose from others were the people who controlled what got written down. And the gaps in the record are, as they always are, as informative as what is present. What we know is this: a group of assassins, wielding blades infused with a fragment of destined death, the rune of death that Marika had removed from the Elden Ring and given to Malekith to hide, struck at multiple targets on a single night. The coordination required for this was extraordinary. These were not opportunistic attacks. They were planned, precise, and synchronized across distances that would have made simultaneous execution almost impossible without careful advance preparation. The primary target was Godwyn the Golden. Godwyn was killed, but killed in a specific and deeply disturbing way, a way that suggests the assassins understood exactly what they were doing with the fragment of destined death they carried, and understood it with the precision of people who had been given very precise instructions. His soul was destroyed while his body survived. He became what the lore calls the first of the dead, neither alive nor departed. His physical form continuing to exist, to grow, to spread, corrupting the deep roots of the Erd tree itself, transforming the underground places of the lands between into something that belongs to no living order. The death roots that fill the deep root depths, the strange corrupted places beneath the earth, the transformation of the underground world into something that is neither what the Erd tree's roots were supposed to be, nor what anything has a name for. These are Godwyn. The prince, who had been the beautiful face of everything the Golden Order could produce, had become something that the Golden Order had no category for. When you descend far enough into the underground, when you reach the places where the corruption is oldest and deepest, what you find there is a face, enormous, pale, familiar in its proportions from the statues above ground. The face of the Golden Prince, pressed into the earth, breathing slowly, dreaming of nothing, in a state that is neither sleep nor death. This is what was done to him. This is what was left behind. I find this, of all the images in Elden Ring, one of the most quietly devastating, not because of its spectacle, the underground is full of spectacle, but because of what it represents. Godwyn had been loved, genuinely, specifically loved, by the people around him in ways that the lore records without ambiguity, and what was done to him was designed, precisely, to be the worst possible thing that could be done to him within the laws of the world that the Erd Tree had made, a world where death has been modified to prevent final endings, and someone found the way to apply that modification as a weapon. Not killing. Trapping. A second target was Ranni, Radagon's daughter with Rennala. The Carrion Witch, who had been designated an Empyrean by the Two Fingers, one of the candidates chosen to potentially succeed Marika and hold the Elden Ring, had been living under the shadow of that designation her entire life. The Two Fingers had chosen her. They expected her to step into the role they had outlined, to become what the Greater Will needed her to become. Ranni had other plans. On the night of the Black Knives, her soul was extracted from her body and placed into a small doll, while her original physical form was allowed to die. She coordinated this with the assassins deliberately. She wanted her soul to escape the grip of the Two Fingers, who had chosen her as a potential successor to Marika, and whose guidance she refused to accept. The Night of the Black Knives was, for Ranni, a jailbreak, a theft of her own future from the hands of beings who had decided what her future was supposed to look like. She paid for her freedom with her body, and she did not look back. But the blade that killed Godwyn and the fragment of destined death embedded in it came from somewhere specific. It came from Malekith's keeping, from the place Marika had hidden the most dangerous thing in the world, the thing that could undo the fundamental premise of the Golden Order's control over life and death. Someone provided that fragment to the assassins. Someone opened the door. The Black Knife assassins were all women, all Newman, all of Marika's people. The connection between the assassins and Marika's own background is not made explicit in any single source, but it accumulates. The coincidence of their origin, the access to something only Mariketh and his closest principals could have supplied, the precise nature of what they did and how they did it, all of it circles back to the same question: who had the means, the motive, and the access? There are those who believe the answer is Ronnie, who arranged the theft of the fragment as part of her own escape plan. There are those who believe the answer is Marika, who gave the fragment to the assassins knowing what they would do with it. There are those who believe the truth involves both of them in some combination or collaboration that the surviving record is not equipped to describe. What I believe is that the Night of the Black Knives required a level of access that only a very small number of beings could have provided, and the person with the most obvious means, motive, and opportunity, the person whose own background connected her to the assassins, whose dissatisfaction with the order she had built had been building for centuries, who distributed the great runes that would make a shattering catastrophic, and who would, not long after this night, do the catastrophic thing, is Marika. If Marika did this, if she arranged for the fragment of destined death to reach the Black Knife assassins, knowing that Godwyn would be killed in the worst possible way, then we have to sit with what that means. A mother who allowed her child to be destroyed in an act designed to deny him even the limited mercy of the death the Golden Order offered, who chose her eldest, her golden son, the face of everything she had built, as the price of beginning the ending. I will not tell you this is definitely true. I will tell you that the evidence, taken as a whole, is difficult to explain otherwise. What the Night of the Black Knives did, regardless of who arranged it, was irreversible. Destined death was no longer fully contained. The fragment used had been returned to the world, however briefly. The Order's most fundamental premise, that death was under control, that the cycle was closed, that the Greater Will and the Erd-Tree together governed what happened to souls in the lands between, had been violated. The crack was real, the air was already escaping, and then Marika finished it. The Shattering is often described in the game's surviving histories as a moment of divine madness, as though something simply broke inside Marika, some limit of grief or despair or accumulated horror reached its threshold, and she struck the Elden Ring in a moment of overwhelming anguish without fully understanding what she was doing. I do not believe this. What Marika did in the Erd-Tree's heart was deliberate. It was, in the specific and terrible logic of her situation, a choice, the most honest choice she had made in centuries, perhaps the only honest choice she had left. Consider what she was carrying in the moment before she acted. She was still Radagon. She was still the aspect of herself that had dedicated decades, possibly centuries, to studying the Order's laws, fighting its wars, scratching its most fundamental principle into the bedrock of the Erd-Tree. The conflict between Marika's doubt and Radagon's absolute devotion had been building for longer than most civilizations exist. Two halves of one being, in complete opposition about the most important question either of them had ever faced, unable to resolve into agreement, because the disagreement was not a misunderstanding, but a fundamental difference in what they each were, unable to simply separate and be done with it, because they were not two separate people. The great runes were in the demigod's hands. Godwyn was already dead in that terrible, incomplete way. The thing that had been done to him was not reversible, not healable, not something the Golden Order had any mechanism for addressing. The Night of the Black Knives had shown that someone, perhaps Marika herself, had already begun the ending. What was left, if the Elden Ring was not shattered? The continuation of a lie. The maintenance of an order that she knew, with perfect clarity, was built on the suppression of things she had once been part of, an eternal cycle that kept the excluded trapped as surely as it kept the blessed comfortable. A civilization that had decided to treat the crucible energy as a curse, the same energy that the Hornsent had treated as holy, the same energy that had produced the people who were now sealed beneath the city. A world that looked, to her clear eyes, more like the Hornsent civilization than she had ever intended it to look. She raised her hand and shattered the Elden Ring. The Elden Beast, the consciousness that had swum through the cosmos and taken up residence within her body, the manifestation of the greater will's will, the thing that was most not Marika within Marika, writhed in opposition. We understand from the final battle of the game that the Elden Beast and Marika are not simply unified, they are, in some genuine sense, in conflict. When we fight the Elden Beast at the game's end, we are fighting something that is also Marika's prison, something that was given to her along with her divinity and has been inside her ever since, not as a welcome guest, but as a fundamental constraint on what she could choose to be. To shatter the Elden Ring against the Elden Beast's resistance from inside the situation she was in, this was not a small act. This was an act of will so total, so consuming, that it required the destruction of the thing she was nominally carrying on behalf of the greater will. This was Marika, finally, after centuries, doing what she had been building toward since the gates of divinity, taking the power that had been given to her in exchange for her service and refusing the terms. The consequences came immediately, and they were catastrophic. The great runes in the demigod's hands became fully autonomous, no longer shards of a whole held in relation to the center, but individual powers complete in themselves, amplifying each demigod's nature beyond anything that had existed before. They did not hold back. They could not hold back. The power they suddenly possessed demanded expression, demanded the world reshape itself around what they were, and the world complied. Radon bent gravity around his enormous frame and held the stars themselves in check, terrified of what would happen if they moved, if the celestial order he had studied so carefully were disrupted, because he had calculated, with the devotion of a true scholar, that the wrong star falling at the wrong moment would end things that needed not to end. Millennia bloomed in Caelid with a devastation that turned the entire region into the wasteland you know today, a confrontation between her rot and Radon's power that left both of them fundamentally changed and left the land between them uninhabitable for generations to come. Rykard retreated to his fortress and began his consumption, feeding himself to the serpent, becoming something that offered immortality to those willing to be absorbed and reborn within him. Moog ascended to his blood-soaked domain, working toward the birth of a new dynasty beneath the gaze of the formless mother, building something that the other demigods chose not to look at directly, because looking at it directly required acknowledging what it was. Morgoth, the omen kept hidden since birth, the shameful secret of the divine lineage, the son who had never been acknowledged, defended the capital that had never acknowledged him, alone, with a loyalty that had never been asked for and was never properly repaid. The Shattering War. It is not entirely clear how long the war lasted. The chronology of Elden Ring is deliberately vague about this, and I think that vagueness is meaningful. The Shattering War was not a historical event with a beginning and an end and a date you could write down. It was a condition, a state of the world that replaced the previous state and eventually exhausted itself, not into peace, not into resolution, but into the specific stasis of forces that have consumed too much to continue destroying each other, but have not found a reason to stop. What the landscape tells us is sufficient. Caelid is a testament to what Millennia and Radon did to each other, and to everything between them, the scarlet rot and the gravity-defying military genius, colliding in a confrontation that neither could survive cleanly. The siege lines around Lindell, visible still in the topography of the land, if you know how to read what you are looking at, speak to what it cost to defend the capital against the armies of demigods who believed they had a right to it. The emptiness of the lands between, all those villages with no villagers, all those roads with no travelers, all those sites of grace standing in silence among ruins that were once homes, is the accumulation of everything the war consumed and did not return. Each surviving demigod retreated to their stronghold with their shard of the Elden Ring. The world between them was left to manage as best it could. The Order's citizens, those who had survived, found themselves in a world that still had the physical structures of civilization, the roads, the churches, the sites of grace that still dispensed their warmth, but had lost the social and political architecture that made those structures meaningful. They wandered, they huddled in whatever remained defensible. They lost, gradually and then quickly, the sense that the world was organized around anything larger than the immediate and the local. And in the Erd Tree's heart, Marika was crucified. Pinned to the rune arc, suspended within the golden light of the tree she had built, imprisoned inside the thing she had tried to destroy, the Elden Beast, whose will she had acted against, whose vessel she had shattered, held her there, or contributed to holding her there, along with the weight of everything she had built collapsing back around her in the moment she acted against it. She was held, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything except wait, in the long patience that had always been her most fundamental quality for what would come. Let us step back for a moment and let us breathe. The world outside is quiet. Whatever hour it is where you are, whatever light or darkness surrounds you, whatever the weight of your day has been, you are here, and the Erd Tree is still standing in the distance of this story, golden and impossible, and Marika is inside it, waiting. Let us think about what we have traced. The Shattering is, at its deepest level, a story about what happens when you build a world from the inside of a wound, not in spite of the wound, but from within it, with the wound still open, still shaping everything it touches. Marika survived extraordinary suffering. She rose from it through intelligence and patience and a willingness to do what was necessary, which sometimes meant doing things that were also terrible. She built something that was genuinely good in many places. The grace of the Erd Tree was real. The warmth it extended to those within the Order was real. The protection it offered in a world that had previously had no protection at all was real. The people who buried their dead at the Erd Tree's roots and trusted in the return were not being deceived about the thing they were trusting in. The return was real. The grace was real. The warmth was real. But she built it from inside her grief, and the grief was real too. The Golden Order was Marika's answer to the Hornsent civilization. It was organized where the Hornsent were organized, powerful where they were powerful, capable of protecting its people in ways the Hornsent had protected theirs. It suppressed what the Hornsent valued, the crucible marks, the ancient energies, the ambiguity and wildness of a world that had not been sorted into categories, because those were the instruments of her suffering. And it is almost impossible to build something that does not, at some level, mirror the shape of what it was built in opposition to. The problem was that it also excluded, in almost exactly the way she had been excluded, the wandering merchants, the misbegotten, the omens Morgot and Moog, her own children, sealed beneath the city she built because their existence was theologically inconvenient. Those who lived in the bodies, and with the gifts that the Order had decided did not merit its grace, lived outside the protection of what Marika had built, in the same way that the Newman had lived outside the protection of the Hornsent civilization. They were not people with full standing. They were objects to be managed. Unfortunate accidents to be neither fully absorbed nor fully destroyed. Marika built her heaven, and her heaven had a shadow, and the shadow looked like what had been done to her. She knew it. I believe she knew it. The evidence for this is not in any single item description or dialogue line, but in the accumulated pattern of her choices, the choices that do not make sense if she is simply a god who built something she believed in, and do make sense if she is a god who built something she had long since stopped believing in and was quietly, patiently, catastrophically dismantling from within. The removal of destined death, the distribution of the great runes, the night of the black knives, with its Numen assassins carrying a fragment of something that had been in Malakath's keeping, the long silence before the shattering, during which we see no record of Marika doing anything that suggests she was working to preserve what she had built. And then the shattering itself. Not the act of someone who had lost their mind, but the act of someone who had found it. Someone who had waited, with the extraordinary patience that had defined her entire life, for the moment when the honest thing and the possible thing were finally the same thing. That is not the act of a madwoman. That is the act of someone in profound, consuming, genuine pain who chose truth over continuance when the moment finally came. There is one more thing I want to tell you before we close. One more thread to follow, and it is perhaps the most important one. She called you here. The tarnished were called home by the returning grace, the light that moved over the sea and touched the exiles in the lands beyond and drew them back to a lands between they had been cast out of generations ago. This calling is attributed, in the Church's surviving accounts, to the guidance of the two fingers, to the greater will's direction, to the divine plan of the order reasserting itself, selecting candidates from among those who had been hardened by exile to come home and restore what was broken. But Melina tells you something else. Melina appears at sites of grace in the early hours of your journey. She is perhaps the most enigmatic figure in a game full of people who do not say quite what they mean. She appears from nowhere, knows you somehow, understands things about you that she should not be able to understand, and offers you a collaboration, her fingers for your grace, a partnership toward a destination neither of you fully explains to the other. She may be Marika's daughter, born of the Erdtree itself, in the space between the shattering and your arrival. She carries in her closed left eye something that at the game's end reveals itself to be the flame of destined death, the very thing Marika removed from the Elden Ring, the thing Malekith was given to keep hidden. What she is doing with it and how she came to have it is a question Elden Ring does not fully answer. I find that silence interesting. I find the location of the flame in Melina's eye and a closed eye and a thing that sees but is not being used to see, suggestive of something being held in reserve. A final option. A last resort. But Melina carries a message that Marika left behind in the darkness of the Erdtree's heart, spoken into the empty air without knowing who would receive it, without knowing if anyone would come at all. Words preserved through some mechanism we do not fully understand, pass through Melina, passed to you. The message is not simple. It does not ask you to restore what was broken. It asks you to become Elden Lord, which could mean restoring what was broken, yes, but could also mean so much else. It asks you to take what is broken, to look at it clearly, more clearly than Marika could, unburdened by the centuries of grief and guilt and compromise that clouded her vision, and to decide what should be made of it. She is asking you to see it as it actually is, not as she needed it to be, not as the order taught it to be, not as the two fingers want it to be, but as it actually is, and to do with that sight what she could not. She had her chance. She built her world and found it wanting, after everything, and rather than maintain a pretense she could no longer sustain, she broke what she had built and trusted that someone would come who could do better. There is something in this, in the image of a god, crucified and broken at the heart of her own shattered creation, leaving a message in the dark for a stranger she would never meet. That moves me more than almost anything else in this game. It is not the image of defeat. It is not even entirely the image of regret, though regret is present in it. It is the image of someone who looked at everything they had built and everything they had failed to be, and made the decision that honesty mattered more than continuance, that truth mattered more than the appearance of truth, that what the world needed was not the pretense of a fixed order, but the honest acknowledgement that the order had never been as fixed as it appeared, and the invitation to someone new, someone unencumbered by the history of its construction, to try to do something better. She did not ask to be saved. She did not ask for absolution or mourning or the kind of forgiveness that would let her off the hook for everything she chose. She asked to be succeeded. She asked someone who was not her to finish what she had started, but to finish it differently, better, if they could manage it. When you finally reach the base of the Erd Tree, when you have gathered enough of the broken world's pieces to force your way inside, when you pass through those enormous golden roots into the blazing interior of the thing that has been watching over everything since before you arrived, you are not simply approaching a final challenge. You are approaching the accumulated weight of everything we have traced tonight, the weight of a girl placed in a jar, of a civilization erased, of a god made from pain, of a world built and found wanting, of an order broken in the most honest act its builder ever performed. All of it is present in that place. All of it is waiting for you to answer it. The game offers you several answers. You can restore the Golden Order, repaired and largely as it was. The wounds sealed, the great runes returned to the Elden Ring, the Erd Tree's light restored to something close to what it was before the Shattering. This is the most direct answer, a continuation, a repair, an affirmation that what existed was worth preserving. It does not address the foundational problems that Marika herself could no longer ignore. The exclusions remain, the closed cycle remains, the shadow of the order remains, but it offers stability. It offers the people of the lands between the familiar warmth of the grace they know, restored after the long cold of the Shattering War. Whether that stability is worth its cost depends on what you believe about the people it leaves outside. And that, I think, is exactly the question the game wants you to hold. You can choose the Age of Stars, Ranni's ending, in which the dark moon rises over the Erd Tree and the Elden Ring is carried beyond the lands between entirely, away from this world into something unknown. Death returns properly. Souls can truly depart, cross the sea, go wherever it is that souls go when they are not held in an eternal cycle by the roots of a tree. The order is not repaired, but replaced, not by another order, but by the absence of one, the freedom of a world that has been released from the grip of the greater will, and left to become whatever it becomes without cosmic interference. Ranni does not promise paradise. She promises change. She promises that whatever comes next will not be built on the same foundations as what came before. She promises, in her specific and unsentimental way, that the future is genuinely open. Whether that openness is terrifying or beautiful, whether it is the openness of possibility or the openness of an abyss, is something she leaves to you to feel. You can choose the Age of the Duskborn, Fia's ending, in which the principle of destined death is restored to the Elden Ring, in which those who live in death are no longer trapped in a state that the Order invented for them, in which some endings are allowed to be final. The Erd Tree does not burn, the Order does not end, but it is amended, fundamentally, at its most fundamental level. The thing Marika removed, the closure that every life deserves, is returned. The wanderers in death are given what the Golden Order denied them, and whatever that costs, Fia believes, is worth paying. You can follow Goldmask's path, the mended Golden Order, corrected, not simply restored to what it was, but rebuilt according to a truer understanding of what it was always supposed to be. This requires a kind of intellectual devotion that the game makes genuinely difficult. You have to find Gold Mask. You have to find Brother Corhin. You have to trace a path through the game's theology with enough care that you can understand what Gold Mask's correction actually is. Not many players do this, but those who do find, at the end of it, something that might be the most optimistic reading of what the Golden Order could become if its practitioners were honest enough about what it was. Or you can go below the capital, find the three fingers waiting in the dark, those monstrous counterparts of the two fingers, beings of fire rather than grace, representatives of something older and stranger than any order, and accept the frenzied flame. Become the Lord of Chaos. Answer the question of what comes after the shattering by burning the question away entirely, reducing everything to the nothing from which the one great first emerged, so that whatever grows from nothing can grow without the weight of all this history pressing down on it. This ending is the one that Melina, if she is present, cannot forgive. She will tell you what she thinks of it, and she will leave. And there is something in that, in the fact that the person who was closest to Marika's final message cannot accept the answer that burns everything down, that tells you something about what Marika actually hoped for. She did not break the Elden Ring because she wanted nothing. She broke it because she wanted something better. There is a difference. I will not tell you which ending is correct. I am not sure there is a correct answer, and I am not sure the game believes there is either. Each of them is honest. Each is a genuine response to a genuine question. And the question, what do you build in the ruins of a heaven that turned out to be imperfect, has never had a clean answer in any story that has ever been told. Every civilization that has ever existed has in some form built its heaven and found it wanting. Every order has carried its shadow. Every god, if you look closely enough, turns out to have been made by something. What I will say is that every ending is a response to Marika. Every choice you make at the foot of the Erd tree is shaped by what she did and what she left behind. She is present in every outcome, even the ones that reject everything she stood for, even the one that burns it all to ash. You cannot step outside her story. You can only decide what comes after it. The lands between are quiet now, in the long hours before the fighting finds its footing again. There are moments, in those hours, when the wind comes off the water and the Erd tree's light is soft, and the ruins look almost like something that was once beautiful. Because they were. Once. They genuinely were. The civilization that stood here before the shattering was broken and unjust in 100 ways, but it was also something. There were people who loved each other in these streets, who raised children and built homes and went to sleep, trusting that the grace of gold would still be there when they woke. The farmers in their fields, watching the Erd tree's light move across the hills, believing in the return. The merchants on the roads between the cities, trusting that the roads were safe enough to walk. The scholars in their towers, spending their lives trying to understand the laws that the Elden Ring encoded into reality, not because understanding would make them powerful, but because the laws themselves were worthy of understanding. The people who built the churches and the chapels and the roadside shrines, who placed Marika's image in every village because they wanted to be reminded in their daily lives that the world was held by something larger than their individual fear. These were not nothing. These were people, real people, living real lives in the imperfect warmth of a world that was better, for many of them, than what had come before. Marika made those ruins. She made the beauty that preceded them. She made the order that produced the demigods, that produced the shattering, that produced the emptiness you walk through now. All of it flows from her survival, from her ascension, from her doubt, from the moment she finally decided that honesty was more important than continuation. She was a shaman from a people who were treated as tools. She survived what was done to her by becoming something that could never be broken the same way again. She climbed through a system designed to consume her and took from that system everything it had been building toward. She built a world for those who had nothing, A world with genuine grace, genuine warmth, genuine protection. And in building it, she lost herself somewhere inside the weight of what maintaining it required her to be. She could not set down what had been done to her, because the setting down would have required a moment of safety she never quite had. She could not look honestly at the shadow in her heaven, because looking honestly at it would have required being willing to dismantle it, and she was not ready to dismantle it until she was. She carried the wound for centuries. She maintained the lie for centuries. She did it because the alternative, the honest acknowledgement that the order was not what she had told everyone it was, would have cost more than she could pay all at once. And when she could no longer carry it, she set it down in the only way she had left, in the most dramatic way available to a god who had removed death from the laws of reality and held the Elden Ring in her body. She shattered it. She opened everything up. She made space for the question she had been refusing to let anyone ask. What should the world be? She did not answer it. She could not answer it. She was too close to it, too made by it, too much a part of the history of the world that question was asking about. But she could make the question possible. She could break open the closed system and let in the air and trust that someone would come who could answer it without her particular blindnesses. She left a message in the dark, words for a stranger, an invitation to see what she had built, clearly and without illusion, and to do with that clarity what she never quite could. You carry that message now. You have carried it this whole time, whether you knew it or not. Every site of grace you have touched, every fragment of the world you have held for a moment before setting it down, every conversation with someone living in the ruins of what she made, all of it is part of the answer she asked you to find. Not the answer she wanted. Not the answer the two fingers want. Your answer. The one that comes from having seen what is here and having chosen to see it clearly. The Erd-tree stands in the distance of this story. Its light is the same light it has always been, warm and golden and unwavering, falling on ruins and on the people trying to live in them, asking nothing, offering everything to those it has decided to offer everything to, holding its silence about the rest. Whatever you decide to do about it, decide with your eyes open. She asked for that, after everything. That is the gift she left you. Sleep well, tarnished the road will still be there when you wake, and it will be yours to walk the way you choose to walk it. That is the only promise the lands between has ever made that it has actually kept.